Nonprofit Social Enterprise Panel. My name is Danny Robbins. I'm the director of the Nonprofit Administration Program at John Carroll. I'm delighted to have you with us this afternoon and our fantastic slate of panelists and our moderator, Alex Campbell. As you may know and probably know, Alex Campbell is an adjunct professor, a full-time lawyer, the go-to guy in town, the go-to guy I go to for social enterprise and nonprofit law. And we are delighted to have him with us this afternoon to moderate, to educate, and to facilitate. So Alex, I will kick it over to you with a very big thank you.
Thank you, Danny. Hi, everyone. So as Danny mentioned, my name is Alex Campbell. I'm a partner at Schneider Smelt Spieth Bell in downtown Cleveland. I've been working with and serving nonprofit organizations my entire private practice career, with a particular focus, both academic and professional interest, on social entrepreneurship in the nonprofit sector. So I'm glad you're all here. I'm glad we're having this conversation, and I'm glad we have such an esteemed panel of experts and people who can talk about their experience with social enterprise, what works, what doesn't, and shed some wisdom to this group. So I'm going to give a brief overview, very brief overview of nonprofit social enterprise in the nonprofit sector, what it is, what it means, what kinds of issues might come up. And then the meat of today's conversation, really what you're all here for, is to hear from Eric Amanfoh, David Sylvan, and Bethia Burke. I'll give introductions of them, more detailed introductions of them when we move to the panel portion, and I will moderate that panel. We will have an opportunity during the panel discussion portion, both for questions from me, but also, most importantly, for questions from you all. So if you have questions, and you have questions during my presentation, or if you have questions during the panel portion, we'll be able to field those to the best of our ability. So without further ado, I'll jump into the substantive discussion. Okay. Okay, so today's topic is social enterprise in the nonprofit sector. And the best place to start is, what the heck are we talking about? What is social enterprise? My favorite definition of, or my favorite answer to that question is whatever you want it to be. Social enterprise is a bit of a chameleon in terms of a topic, but I think a better, probably more formal answer to that question is the use of market-based approaches to solving social problems. And as we'll discuss both in the substantive portion and then also in our panel discussion, you can imagine why social enterprise is important in the nonprofit sector. With ever increasing demand for grant dollars and foundation dollars, and an ever blurring of the for-profit and nonprofit sectors, many nonprofit organizations have engaged or are considering engaging in social entrepreneurship activity. And today's discussion is to at least tip of the iceberg. What does that mean? And what does a nonprofit organization that is doing this kind of work or thinking about doing this kind of work need to think about? Okay, so a couple of issues that we'll talk about today. We'll focus today on the formation of a social enterprise, but there are a couple of big issues that you think about. How can a nonprofit organization engage in social enterprise activity and maintain its ever important 501c3 status? How can an organization that has earned revenue manage the potential tax implications of that earned revenue activity? We all know that most 501c3 organizations, the revenue from those activities is exempt from tax. That's what it means to be a tax exempt organization. But we also know that most organizations that engage in what's called unrelated business activity are subject to tax on that activity. How can the organization manage the risk associated with social enterprise activity? Sometimes these activities are a bit different from the nonprofit's primary area of expertise or the organization's primary activities. How can the organization engage in mission-aligned, values-driven social entrepreneurship without risking the corpus of the organization or otherwise potentially putting the organization's valuable assets at risk? Similarly, not just the financial risk, but the potential reputational risk of engaging in, as I said, an activity that is a little different from what the organization has done in the past. Maybe it's a little business-like. And how does the organization, as it engages in social enterprise activity, how does it make sure that it addresses the potential claim that we're sort of shifting away from what we know best, what we're best at? Intellectual property, how do we make sure that we maintain the integrity of the brand? All organizations, whether there's trademarks or registered trademarks, registered copyrights, that sort of thing, or not, there is some intellectual property built up in the organization's name. And how, as you pursue social enterprise activity, do we make sure we don't lose track of that? To the extent that we have grant makers on the call today, so foundations, other entities that have significant endowments, for example, might engage in social enterprise activity, not directly, but by making equity investment or other kinds of investments, so impact investing. How to account for the social enterprise activity. And again, the focus for today is you're thinking about a social enterprise, you are either doing it or you're thinking about doing it. How do you do it? How does your organization literally engage in this activity? So when we think about social enterprise activities, there's a pretty wide range, but the activities really fall into three buckets. So you can see the buckets here. Not sure why the hybrid is a cut up kiwi, but we have our options here. And we'll talk a lot about sort of as I said, the blurring of the lines in between here, a little bit on the left side of the hybrid and a little bit on the right side of the hybrid in the middle of this category. So level set, we have this idea, social enterprise activity, again, using mission-based approach, market-based approaches to solving a social problem. So you decide you want to sell something using a workforce that is coming from re-entering society from the criminal justice system, or you decide you want to sell something and be particularly sensitive about the sourcing of the materials, or any number of activities where the pure financial bottom line is not necessarily the only thing, or is not the only thing that drives the activity. So there are a wide range of options available. Again, today we're focusing on the nonprofit side of this decision tree, but there are a wide range of options available. And what I'll do for the next 5 to 7 minutes is quickly go through, literally slide by slide, what these options are, just for definitional help here. Make sure we understand what is an LLC, what is a corporation, and then bring it back to the discussion about the nonprofit, because the nonprofit has to think about potentially the right corporate form for its social enterprise activity. So it's helpful to have that background. And again, questions, if you are any questions, happy to answer those in the context of the panel, and also going to one, circulate these slides to the group, and two, that slide will have my contact information. Happy to talk offline if you have any further questions. Okay, so first option, most obvious option, is you do your social enterprise activity in the nonprofit. Nonprofits, as we said, generally don't pay income tax, but do pay tax on their unrelated business activities. A very formal, board-driven corporate governance structure. There are rules, both under state and federal law, that funds that come into the nonprofit are to be used in furtherance of the nonprofit's charitable purpose, and can't be used to benefit an individual or a private corporation. And the most important thing for purposes of a social enterprise discussion is that nobody owns a nonprofit corporation. I like to think, as Danny mentioned, teach nonprofit law, I like to think and sort of have the initial conversation about, think about a nonprofit as if it is owned by the public, and you are a steward of the nonprofit's assets on behalf of the public. So the pros and cons of a nonprofit corporation as a social enterprise vehicle, again, the exemption. So if the activity is related, exempt from paying tax, that can be a very valuable asset to the organization. It is by definition mission aligned. You can potentially have donations that come in that are deductible to the donors. some of the cons, as I said, by definition, mission aligned, that can be a little bit tricky when we're talking about, again, kind of business-like activity in a social enterprise context, and whether the activity is in fact charitable, as it's defined under state and federal law, might be a little bit different than mission aligned. There's also some limited flexibility in the organization's ability to change. Nonprofit corporations are intentionally deliberative bodies that answer to a lot of different constituencies and a lot of different regulatory authorities. And so the process of making significant change can sometimes be difficult. But I'm excited to hear from Eric, Bethia, and David about what their organizations have done and also how they've made the decisions that they've made to exit from various social enterprise activities, because all three of their organizations are at some level subject to these complicated governance considerations. So when we talk about social enterprise, the first thing we think about in a nonprofit, maybe it can't be conducted by the nonprofit itself. We think about, should there be another entity? Should there be a wholly owned subsidiary? Should there be a for-profit subsidiary? Should there be a nonprofit subsidiary? How do we, as a nonprofit corporation, maybe it's because the activity is a little different, or maybe it's because the activity isn't related for purposes of tax. So there might be some tax, and we need to figure out a way to protect our organization. And so normalize the discussion about having a multiple entity structure. It doesn't have to be overly complicated. It's certainly more complicated than having just your regular nonprofit corporation, which is the only entity that you have. But as you engage in sophisticated social enterprise activity, this kind of conversation has to be a part of the deal. And we'll talk in a moment about what the various related entities might actually look like. So the pros and cons of having a related entity, again, pro is that you can enjoy the benefits of the nonprofit while also enjoying the benefits of the for-profit. You can manage risk. If you have a wholly owned subsidiary, say your wholly owned subsidiary sells the stuff that is sourced using the ethical sourcing that I used in my example, but there's the risk that organization is going to sell something that's going to result in a potential lawsuit. If you manage the related entities correctly, the activities of that subsidiary are separate from the nonprofit corporation. So again, heaven forbid the subsidiary is sued. If you've maintained the separation between the two, the nonprofit corporation's assets can't be used to satisfy the debts of the subsidiary. It also allows for literal separation, as I mentioned, which is helpful in potentially avoiding claims of mission creep. You say, we're still focused at the nonprofit corporation level on whatever it is that we do. And we decided to create this subsidiary because we know it's different. We know it's a little bit different. And we're more comfortable, not just for risk management purposes, not just for tax purposes, but because it's a little different. We want it to be in a separate corporation. Related entities, as I said before, it's not as simple as just having one entity. So there are potential challenges with respect to tax, and the compliance costs are more than they would be if you only had one. You've got two separate sets of books and records. You've got two separate sets of tax returns. You've got to maintain that separation between the entities, and it's a balancing act, whether it's worth the cost of the compliance versus the benefits that you get from having that multiple entity. So a couple of options when you're thinking about a related entity or a social enterprise more generally. First option, this is really kind of business 101, thinking about business corporate form 101. Sole proprietorship, there's no protection here. This is never the right answer. We're not going to spend any more time on it because it is as if Alex Campbell is just doing the work by himself, 100% responsible for everything that I do. Partnership is essentially the same thing as a sole proprietorship, except that each partner is totally responsible for the other partner's activities. So if it's Alex and Danny as partners in a venture, I totally screw up. Danny is every bit as responsible as I am for my screw up. And for that reason, it's generally not a good idea to engage in any kind of business activity, whether it's a social enterprise or otherwise, as either a sole proprietor or a true partnership. So the next two options are the ones that you're going to be more familiar with, a C corporation and an LLC. C corporation, this is the structure that you're going to be most familiar with. Shareholders of a corporation driven by a board, in many ways similar to a nonprofit corporation, obviously in other ways fundamentally different. But C corporations are what you sort of the prototypical corporation is going to be a corporation. The directors of the corporation are entitled to the same kind of protection that similar kind of protection as directors of a nonprofit corporation, which is that they're not individually responsible for the corporation's debts, but the corporation is responsible for those debts. So benefits C Corp, because it's familiar, it has the ability to raise, it's kind of what everyone expects when you're thinking about bringing in money. It's the most, as I said, familiar. It's the one that an investor will likely ask for because they know they can buy shares of the corporation for a certain amount of money, and this is what it means for them to be a shareholder in the corporation. Also, corporations have been around for a long time, so it's a very well-developed body of law. Cons of a corporation as a social enterprise vehicle, similar to a nonprofit corporation, very stringent, strict governance requirements. Tax issue, there's going to be some tax issues for the corporation pays tax and then it issues dividends to the shareholders and the shareholders pay tax. So that's that double taxation. And there's an argument to be made that a corporation is by definition, the directors of a corporation have a duty to focus on the economic bottom line. That the corporation isn't allowed to think about things like mission. Next option, this is increasingly the most common, probably the most common corporate form that we see both in the for-profit world and the nonprofit world is an LLC. Combines the flexibility of a partnership with the protections of a corporation. And by definition, the activities of the LLC are passed through to the members of the corporation. So if you have a nonprofit corporation that is a member of an LLC, the nonprofit corporation is going to report the LLC's activities on the nonprofit corporation's tax return. So pros and cons, we already went through these. One con to mention with respect to the LLC is that there's so much flexibility that sometimes that's actually a bad thing. Thinking about a potential investor, they're really going to look very closely at the LLC operating agreement because there's the ability for the members of the LLC to essentially define how the LLC works, how money comes in, how money comes out, and the investors really have to pore through that document to make sure that it's going to work for them in a way that a corporation, because it really is what it is a little more familiar. Okay, so a couple more potential social enterprise vehicles. Benefit corporation, newly available, been about a year now, April of last year, almost exactly a year since benefit corporation legislation was implemented in Ohio. Finally, it was one of the last states to do so. So benefit corporation is really a corporation with a bit of a nonprofit corporation flair. So it is a for-profit corporation, to be clear. It is a for-profit corporation, but by definition, the benefit corporation has to think about mission in the decisions that it makes. So pros and cons, it is a for-profit corporation that has charitable components. So it doesn't have to be limited to charitable purposes. It, as I say here, legitimizes the claim that we're our bona fides, we're a mission-oriented organization. We're required to be a mission-oriented organization. There is another trade-off of a benefit corporation, similar to a nonprofit corporation, is that the benefit corporation has transparency requirements. It has to make publicly available reports that a typical privately held company would never have to do. Also relatively new and relatively untested. So again, if you're thinking about bringing in potential investors into your social enterprise activity as a benefit corporation, you may find an investor that's a little bit wary of the benefit corporation model because they're just not sure how it works. Variation on the benefit corporation and is the certified B Corp. So certified B Corps and benefit corporations are two different things. Many times benefit corporations are certified B Corps, but they are not synonymous terms. Certified B Corp is a designation granted by a national nonprofit organization called B Labs. The organization has to meet certain governance requirements, transparency requirements, and then it gets this little B with the circle in it, similar to LEED certification or fair trade certification. So it is a privately managed certification process, again, lends to the certified B Corp a certain credibility that this organization is vetted by a third party and is committed as an organization, committed to these mission-oriented ideals. So again, the B Corp pros and cons are very similar to the benefit corporation pros and cons. Pros are that it's flexible, cons are that it's flexible. That there are a lot of questions about sort of how this works. And the reality is it's very much here to stay. And so that some of these details are going to be worked out over the next 10 years in the court system as for example, a shareholder in a benefit corporation sues and says, we don't think that you're being mission oriented enough. We don't think that you're as focused on mission as you should be. And a court will eventually weigh in and say, the directors have this obligation to, this is what it means for an organization to meet that benefit standard. So a couple of other hybrid options, low profit limited liability company, not available in Ohio, only in a couple states. Benefit LLC, same thing. All of these are really state specific. None of them are available in Ohio. We already went through the ones that are available in Ohio, but I did want to highlight this tracker. So this is a map of the United States, and you can click on it to see which of the various options are available in which states. And so again, Ohio was for a long time kind of sticking out as a sore thumb as not having a benefit corporation option. And for all of my years of practice, that kept getting put onto the agenda and not making its way into law, and it finally did last year. So there, we've actually helped form a couple of benefit corporations under Ohio law. Another option, which David can probably speak to in the panel portion, but joint ventures common in the healthcare context. So a way for another way for a nonprofit corporation and a for-profit corporation to formally commit to each other on a particular activity. The joint venture is as I say, a formal structure. An affiliation is a less formal structure, a little bit of a loosey-goosey term as far as the law is concerned. One last note on the affiliation and relationship between a for-profit and a nonprofit in the social enterprise world is we also seek what we call cause marketing and commercial co-venturing, where think about like the Subaru Share the Love event, or any number of for-profit companies that say, if you buy a case of Pepsi, we'll donate $1 for every case of Pepsi you buy, we'll donate $1 to this charity. That is a kind of social enterprise affiliation, because there's obviously the market-based approach, buying the case of Pepsi, and the mission orientation, which is that at least a portion of that is going to a charity. So how do we decide? How do we decide? Big picture, how do you decide whether you are a budding social entrepreneur? How do you decide whether a nonprofit corporation is the appropriate vehicle versus a for-profit, one of the various options we just talked about? I think the biggest question is, do you want to own it? Do you want to have equity in this thing? Because if you want to have equity in this thing, look to the left side of that decision tree. Look to the for-profit side of the equation, because the nonprofit corporation is just never going to get you there. The other questions are, to me, less central. They're step two in the discussion process, because what are you doing? Some activities can't be done as a nonprofit corporation because they are not charitable. They will not be charitable, even if they have a kind of a mission component. Where will the money come from? If the money's mostly going to come from investment, you're going to have some trouble on the right side of that decision tree, in the nonprofit corporation side, because most investors are going to expect to see a for-profit vehicle. and they're going to expect to see a for-profit vehicle that is not owned by another nonprofit. Desired level of control, obviously, for-profit corporations, especially LLCs, have the ability to be pretty tightly controlled by their owners. Nonprofit corporations, as we discussed, are much more democratic in their decision making, for better or for worse. Also, the transparency is a big issue. So, as a nonprofit corporation, so you've gone through that initial decision making process. You think you're good. You think you are a charitable activity. You don't care about the equity ownership piece. You think nonprofit corporation is the right approach for you. How do you decide as an organization whether you should do the activity directly, just do the social enterprise activity directly through the nonprofit corporation, or whether you should have a subsidiary entity of some sort or an affiliated entity of some sort? So again, the nature of the business, literally, what are you doing? Some activities can't be done at the nonprofit corporation level, or if they are done at the nonprofit corporation level, will subject the corporation to tax. What is the nature of the activity? What is the risk profile of the activity? Again, not just the kind of traditional risk that you think about, lawsuit risk, but also reputational risk. Is there a reason for the organization to have that activity on paper and in practice separate from the nonprofit corporation? And then, of course, the costs associated with creating a multiple entity structure and complying with and maintaining the ever important separateness that is required for the nonprofit corporate multi-entity structure to really truly work. Okay, and then you've decided we're going to do our social enterprise as a nonprofit corporation. We've decided that we, for various reasons, want to have a multiple entity structure with our nonprofit corporation. How do you decide among the various options, among the various potential corporate forms? So you've got one option would be to have just another nonprofit. That is an option, but assuming that it is a for-profit subsidiary of some sort that you're thinking about, we really go through all the same kinds of discussion or decision-making points that you would as a budding social entrepreneur thinking about starting a for-profit. Think about the tax piece. Think about the structural. What does it mean to own this thing? What does it mean to be a member? What does it mean to be a shareholder? Will there be a board at the subsidiary level? Some of those things will matter as you decide what the right for-profit subsidiary type structure will be for your nonprofit corporation. In some cases, it matters what the state of formation will be. You'll hear and accurately that a corporation should always be a Delaware corporation, or increasingly Wyoming corporation, or not Nevada or Wyoming for some things. For nonprofit corporations, I always say that it's best to be in the state that you're in, physically in, because you're just going to be banging your head against the wall trying to manage maintaining your good standing in the state of incorporation, and then also in the state you're actually in. For a for-profit subsidiary, it's a slightly different analysis, but I think that think before you just immediately jump to, well, let's do a Delaware corporation, because that's what corporations are. If you're doing an LLC, it doesn't really make any sense, for example, to have a Delaware LLC of an Ohio that is wholly owned by an Ohio nonprofit corporation. I think you're just looking for trouble if you do it that way. Also, the transparency, as we discussed, the various reporting is important to think about. And again, always important to think about costs, both on the front end and maybe even more importantly on the back end. On the front end, it can be relatively easy to create a limited liability company that is wholly owned by a nonprofit corporation. But if you don't think through what it means to maintain a limited liability company that is wholly owned by a nonprofit corporation in perpetuity, I think you're selling yourself a little bit short as far as thinking through the process and the cost. So I know that was a ton of information very fast. Believe me, I could talk even faster. But what we will do today, and what you're all really here for, is to hear from our panelists who have gone through these processes at various levels. They've had conversations about creating a nonprofit corporation, creating a social enterprise, managing a social enterprise. I think everybody, Bethia, David, Eric, have all managed a social enterprise at some level or another. And so we have a couple of questions that I have a couple of questions for Eric and Bethia and David, which I'm going to start asking them as soon as they give their introductions. But I also really do want this to be as interactive as a Zoom conference can be. And so if you have a question, drop your question into the chat, and either Hannah or I will grab those questions and make sure they make their way to Eric or David or Bethia or all three. So if you have a question for anybody individually, say that. If you have a question for the full group, say that. And before we jump into the questions, I will allow each of them, or I will invite each of them to give a very brief overview of who they are and why they're here. So we'll start with Eric.
Hello, all. I'm Eric Amanfoh, and I am the partner of finance at Jumpstart. I've been with Jumpstart Inc. 2 years, 10 months now. So I have a June anniversary date, so it's easy to remember. You hit that six month mark. So as the partner of finance, I manage the day-to-day operations of the finance department. Yeah, that's my spiel.
Thank you, Eric. David.
Good afternoon, everyone, and Alex and John Carroll, thanks for having us. I'm David Sylvan, I'm president of UH Ventures. We are the innovation and commercialization platform for the hospital system. The system's now up to close to 25 hospitals with the recent acquisition of Lake Health, a 33,000 employee organization with a $5 billion top line, and a very, very complicated and convoluted structure from the perspective of all the elements that Alex so eloquently walked us through in his previous slides. My platform is the one that is definitely the one under scrutiny when it comes to the attraction of UBIT risk and the elements of standing up and spinning out for-profit opportunities, because part of our mandate is the identification and the sourcing of alternative sustainable revenue streams in order to sustain the mission. And the majority of those activities are by their very nature for profit. But we'll get into that certainly in the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Bethia.
Good afternoon. My name is Bethia Burke. I am the president of the Fund for Our Economic Future. The fund has been around for 18, 19 years now, and was originally formed as this collaboration of the philanthropic community in Northeast Ohio to address issues of overall economic vibrancy. So through the years, we have put funding to work to do things like stand up Jumpstart, but also work on other issues of job creation, job preparation, and job access. So things that the move into economic development at the time was a new one for foundations, many of the foundations locally, and figuring out how to do that and the different structures we can use to do that. We now bill ourselves as the creative space for equitable economic growth. So thinking about us as a place to try things that can drive us to a more growing and opportunity-rich economy.
Thank you. So my first question is to all of you, and I think each of you sort of touched on this a little bit, but what does social entrepreneurship, social enterprise, whatever definition you want to use, what does that mean to your organization?
I guess I'll go first because
go ahead.
I'll go first because you asked me to introduce myself first. But for us at Jumpstart, Jumpstart is a venture development organization. Our mission is helping entrepreneurs grow, researchers commercialize, and corporations innovate. What that means is that we combine the principles of venture capital and nonprofit economic development, basically. So for us, the social enterprise is generating capital or raising capital so that we can invest in entrepreneurs in our community, and that promotes our mission.
Great, thank you. We'll come back more to how Jumpstart does that in a few. Bethia or David?
Bethia, go ahead.
Thanks. I think when we think about the work of the fund, I really appreciated your overview, Alex, and the sort of the broad range of structures through which work can be done to advance a variety of purposes. And so through the work of the fund, we really try to think about what structure works for the thing that we're trying to advance, and sort of how when and where pure grant making makes sense, and how when and where something else makes sense. And I think that in particular in the economic development world, that there are sort of different ways to think about beneficiaries. So for example, I mentioned that we funded the startup of the economic development system, partners like Jumpstart, Bio Enterprise, and some others, 20 years ago. And sort of over time thought differently about how to engage in that work, given that those organizations started to generate outcomes that resulted in private gains for a variety of companies, right? So I think it's in part about a mindset that is finding the right approach for the thing that you're doing at the time, and as well as in the long term. And then the other thing that we have thought about, I don't know if we'll get into this today, Alex, is how to sort of try to change the perception around who can benefit from growth gains. So, they're in markets that grow rapidly, there's a lot of talk about gentrification and how gentrification is a negative consequence a lot of times for residents who live in a neighborhood. But trying to think about how to take growth gains and make that a positive outcome for residents in a community is one of the things that we've been working on over the past year and a half. And so thinking about those structures that can make that possible, and can drive towards those outcomes.
Great, thank you. David?
So I think I'll come at the response, Alex, from the two perspectives, the macro and the micro. The macro being, of course, university hospitals, the system, and what does social enterprise mean to the system. It's central to the organizational DNA, the very nature of the product we sell, if you will, the services, the offerings, all start and end with a person, a community, a population in some form of need. And it's not just disease state management or chronic care, but more and more whole life management, with healthcare in general, providers specifically now attempting to engage the patient and the family far further upstream, with that goal of predicting, preempting, intervening for, candidly, the betterment of society, hence the social component, and to positively impact the substantial cost burden that we're all familiar with that healthcare has on society. That's the macro. The micro is the platform that I represent, which is structured as a for-profit, not-for-profit subsidiary of the system, if you will. And our role is to carefully give commercial life to those tools, processes, technologies that then impact patients, and to do so from a mission lens. There's always the cognizance of a person at the end of the line, so to speak, when it comes to any of the opportunities that we invest in or any of the opportunities that we look to incubate or accelerate. So there's the duality between the system and then the microcosm of ventures within that.
Great, thank you. So I think, David, you already answered this question, but Eric, I'm particularly interested in your answer to the next one, which is describe the social enterprise activities that the Jumpstart is engaged in, and describe a high level the structural piece. Like how does Jumpstart work? Does Jumpstart have subsidiaries? Does it is it structured like what David's organization is? Is it structured like Bethia? Is it something else? Can you speak to that?
Okay, so for Jumpstart, the way the structure works is we have the nonprofit that was birthed in 2004 when leaders in the community decided they wanted to advance venture capital in economic development in a meaningful way in the community. And the way to go about it was to bring about a company that's gonna help entrepreneurs, right? If you help entrepreneurs grow, if you invest in entrepreneurs and you help them grow, they're eventually going to establish companies in the communities and employ people in the communities, and the community will benefit from that. So that's how that nonprofit came about. And for us, the structure of the nonprofit is at the top, right? So for us to be able to gain capital, we set up funds. So a bunch of funds. So we started with the Evergreen Fund. That was our very first fund. And that we partnered with the state, and we also partnered with some philanthropic partners in the community. The partnership with the state in the early days came as a grant. Nowadays, it's structured a little different. It's a loan, where you take a loan, which you pay the state the money back. So how it started, it has evolved, right? So then you get the money to start the fund. We have our nonprofit, our funds, or we set up a management company, which is an LLC, right? That's going to be the managing partner in the fund. So the fund is also a separate LLC operating as a partnership, right? That's where you're able to get into, if you want to raise funds, you can have LPs in those funds.
So if somebody wanted to actually put money into one of these companies,
right,
put it into this LLC, which is managed by.
They become so the fund always needs a general partner, and the general partner is the management company that's established.
Related to
right.
Jumpstart. Okay, cool.
Yeah, so that's how the structures work.
So Bethia, you mentioned that the fund, and I know the fund literally funded in part the beginning of Jumpstart. You mentioned that the fund is responsive to the particular project in its structuring considerations. And I know the question of economic development as charitable activity is a bit of a tricky one, but how do you decide whether to, as an organization, how do you decide whether we should be making a grant, or we should be making an investment, or we should be doing something else?
Yeah. Well, to start, our back before I was with the fund, our board was pretty conservative. So I think that just from a starting point, from a foundations and philanthropic perspective, they didn't want to do more than make a grant in something. So it was very much a leap to get into economic development as a charitable purpose, and using the fund as a way to do that together, and as a way to move things that really needed to be moved in Northeast Ohio, but maybe they didn't have a way to do it through their own foundations. It varied by foundation, but sort of broadly. And there was also this idea early on in the fund that we wouldn't be around forever, that it was, I wasn't here so I could make fun of them. They were going to fix the economy in 3 to 6 years, right? That it was like, they're going to take some market-based approaches, and we're going to stand some stuff up, and things are going to be great. And that as the fund has changed over time, there's been this recognition that there's a value in the structure of the Fund for Economic Future to advance a variety of kinds of ideas, even as things that we have put money towards have solidified and grown into full-fledged, well-functioning, sort of really successful organizations. One of the early things I was engaged with in the fund's work was actually this question, Alex, of when we are giving money to organizations that are serving companies that are generating private gain, why are we doing that in a way that is just a grant? So there was a shift some 10 years ago or so that whenever we do, now we had a whole big, long, drawn out discussion about it. And then we came to the conclusion that anything that has really a clear path towards some sort of economic gain, that we should be understanding what that mechanism is to recapture it, because our funds come from charitable purpose. And so we structured a variety of different kinds of ways of doing that, just depending on the kinds of service that were being offered. So whether that was, in some cases, connected to a fee-for-service kind of model that some of the intermediary partners were doing, whether that was based on, some of the intermediaries had a way of investing in companies. And so when companies have an exit event, money comes back into the system, and really trying to say, look, we don't know, there's not going to be one way of always having an agreement, but that agreement, and we're facing it right now, actually, we're looking at standing up a consortium that would enable companies in Ohio to be more competitive for federal contracts. So it's like a economic development purpose, but also connects directly with private companies, making sure that we do that in a way that that structure both contributes back, right, if you use philanthropic dollars for it, but also if that organization generates private gain, and that private gain goes back into the 501c3, that goes back into the economic development system, because that's what the original money was for. So if that tracks.
Yeah, no, that's very helpful. And I'm as interested in how the sausage is made, in this kind of conversation as in the end result, because I think in many ways, the folks on the call are, again, whether they're in social enterprise activity or thinking about being in social enterprise activity, understanding the organizational dynamics is very important in how to introduce what, as you said, the fund's board in the very beginning thought of it as like, ooh, we shouldn't be doing that. That's not what nonprofits do. And I'll tell you, in my 10 years of practice, that I've seen a notable shift in just that 10 years of original really very palpable hesitation about anything that looked business-like, to now more of a understanding that is, it's been normalized and continues to be ever more normalized, and in some cases is almost required of organizations to be innovative in that way. So I have a related question, but again, I reiterate to the group, if you do have questions, drop in the chat. Happy to grab those. Otherwise, we'll keep going with the questions we have. So, Bethia, you spoke to it in your answer, but Eric, David, interested in past, present, future, at social enterprise as component of your organization's strategic plan. Is social enterprise, has social enterprise always been baked in and will always be baked in? Is there some thought maybe we should do more, maybe we should do less? Talk to me about the evolution of strategy, social enterprise as strategy, or a component of strategy for your organizations.
I'll take a first run at that, Alex. I think for us, it started as a series of one-offs and opportunistic capital deployments, and the genesis of the inception, if you will, of what was first University Hospitals Innovation, and now the morphing into a more traditional embedded corporate venture capital platform, was to take the opportunism out of this and make it programmatic, make it repeatable. And so for us, the mandate is very distinctly more, not just more shots on goal, but bigger shots on goal. And so, for example, Eric will tell you that we are co-GPs in a health collaboration fund, which is a pre-seed seed fund designed specifically to lure and attract either entities to the region or to bolster those who are already here from the perspective of that early stage funding, that early stage de-risking. Organizationally, we also are permissioned to tap into various pockets of money that have specific designation. We have something known as the MRI, which is obviously a clinical pun, not that funny, clinical pun on mission-related investing. And we're able to use that wallet, so to speak, specifically for investments that will impact the greater good. So for example, how might we underwrite transportation for those in need, because access is such a critical challenge for the region. The notion of missed appointments or the inability to get to appointments is a tremendous challenge that we know we need to face. And so we've used a combination of those mission-related funds as well as our more traditional venture capital pool to, for example, invest in the Greater Cleveland Transport Authority, but then also in a startup known as Roundtrip, which is a non-emergency medical transport platform, which is largely AI and data driven. So there's a duality always for us in terms of what are we trying to achieve and which path, specifically from the perspective of which funding mechanism might get us there in conformance and in compliance with many of the rules and regs that you laid out in your earlier slides. So it puts me in a pretty interesting position that I have a variety of ways in which I can think about capital deployment, but it all gets driven by what is the purpose, what is the mission, and what is the designated outcome.
Great, thank you. Again, a sausage making kind of question. When your organizations, so Bethia, you've talked about changes that the fund has made over the years. Eric, you've talked about how social entrepreneurship is baked in there. David, same thing. But from a decision-making perspective, organizational decision-making perspective, when there are these kinds of strategic shifts, or in David's case, put on the gas, kind of let's accelerate the activity we're already doing, who makes those decisions and how are those decisions communicated within the organization, or those directives communicated within the organization?
So for us, it always comes back to the nonprofit and the nonprofit's board, right? So our CEO, since we're a venture capital, it's like David said, it's foot on the gas too, right? You want to get to fund number one, fund number two, and then fund number three. That's how you build on what you started, and that's how you affect outcomes by generating profit or exits for companies to grow. So you want to keep going. Start fund number one, fund number two, fund number three. So
it comes from the board. The directive comes from the board, and then the idea is to start that snowball running, so that you have, the more money you have, the more good work you can do.
Right. So for us, the money we make from investing in startups, when they get to a successful exit, we turn it back around. It goes back to the nonprofit, and that's invested back in our work that we do. We do economic development work in Northern Ohio, and we partner with the state in their ESB program. That's the entrepreneurial
signature.
Or they change it to services, but services program. So they change signature to services. But so we partner with the state on that. And for us to partner with that, we need to match the funds that we're taking from the state. So the match comes into play, where if you're taking $1, you need to match $1. So where are you going to get that match from? Since you don't have a big fundraising machine going, where you're going to all these philanthropic organizations and raising funds, and even that fundraising mechanism has changed, and there's been a shift where, like Bethia said, it's gone from grant making to something else, right? So they want to see where the benefits coming from. They want you to show that there's a match. You're raising, or you're seeking $1, but you're also putting in $1 yourself, right? And it turns to $2, and then you're using the $2 to do more good in the community.
Yeah, great. Bethia?
Yeah, so we at the fund have a we have a board like any nonprofit, but we push really hard on the idea that our board is not a traditional nonprofit board in that we're what we call a member-led organization. So there is a great deal of collaborative decision-making and sort of making sure that it is co-creation, not just teeing up an idea for approval. But in that process, one of the things that I really try to pay a lot of attention to is what we're motivating with the style of agreement that we go with. So when we are, so for example, when we changed how we did grant making with economic development organizations, really raising this question of Magnet, an organization we funded, could do fee-for-service work for its clients. If it's going to do fee-for-service work for its clients and it is going to have to reimburse the fund for a recoverable grant, it's going to pick a different kind of client than if it is a forgivable grant. If it's only repaid if they happen to get recouped, but that's not the primary, their primary driver. And there is, when we make grants and when we make these decisions about these structures, the fund exists to try to drive more economic growth, but in a more equitable way. And we're looking not to fund a consulting firm, right? The private sector can fund a consulting firm. There's no reason to have philanthropy involved in that business. What we're really trying to do is, in that instance, is connect with those businesses who wouldn't otherwise access these services to grow. And ideally, those are businesses that, for whatever reason, also drive more equitable growth. They're in the core city. They're led by a person of color or a woman, that there are characteristics of businesses we're also trying to grow. And so I think, just to your question about structure and how we decide that, it's really about asking the right questions about what you're trying to drive when you make those decisions, and not sort of being caught up in the idea of the moment, oh, philanthropy is doing more social enterprise, or, oh, philanthropy is doing more recoverable grants, more PRIs. It's how to use the structure to drive the outcome that you're trying to get to in the most effective way, and really asking, sort of teeing up those questions.
David, anything on that question? No, it's okay. If not.
I would just add that when we were launching ventures and innovation, I had the opportunity to visit with 20, 25 systems around the country, and to really learn what we should and shouldn't do from the perspective of exemplars, and to perhaps avoid some landmines. And to a person, the platforms that failed did not have board level visibility. They were started as skunk works. There was the idea of someone who had a great vision within an organization, but they did not, unfortunately, have that top of the house support, endorsement, and underwriting to be successful. And part of that is also reinforcing the need for a lot of patience. As Bethia and Eric will tell you, we deploy $1. First of all, it may never come back. Second of all, if it does, it's in 7 to 10 years. So you're going to go cash negative for a long time, and in a big way, perhaps, before you see any type of distinct return. So it does take some leadership fortitude, and you have to have proximity to the board. The way in which we're structured, we've actually consecrated a standalone entity known as the Ventures Advisory Committee, made up of some board members, but many who are not, because we want that arm's length adjudication, that filterless feedback loop that would support our efforts and our initiatives and give our work credibility at the board level for the organization. So that would be the only element I would add to what Eric and Bethia have stated.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And the other thing that I often see, and it's whether it's in a conversation about strategic planning or a conversation about social entrepreneurship, is not only do you need board buy-in and organizational visibility or leadership visibility into what you're doing, you also need staff buy-in. Because what we sometimes see, and again, we see it in strategic planning, but we also see it in social entrepreneurship activity, is if the board has a kind of a half-baked idea about, well, we want to do social entrepreneurship, we should start a catering company. And nobody asked the question, does anyone know how to run a catering company? That's not going to succeed. If there's no staff capacity to actually run the business, the best idea is not going to, well, it's probably not a good idea, or it's not a very, at least it's not a fully formed idea. So I think it's important that there is that the direction comes from the organizational leadership as is required under the nonprofit corporation structure, but also that those leaders are inviting the folks who are actually going to be boots on the ground into that conversation and making sure that how can we support you in actually achieving this objective that we've defined in our plan. So a question in the chat and this is a free for all for all three of us, or all three of you. What are some successes and pitfalls that you've seen with smaller organizations trying to start social enterprises? Have you seen some social enterprise, maybe the example I just gave of the nonprofit that decides it wants to start a catering company because social enterprise is the hot thing. What have you seen in this kind of smaller scale social enterprise in the nonprofit context?
I think that is your hypothetical catering company example is not too far from things that I think we've really seen. So I think one of the things I've on the pitfall side, one of the things that I've seen is in a small nonprofit, there usually is not that much money. There's usually not that much money to hire a new CEO of a new social enterprise. And so the existing CEO might try to do both things. I'm going to run the nonprofit that I already run, which is I'm already working 60 to 80 hours a week on because I already short-staffed, and I'm going to start a social enterprise because even in the case where there's, I think, maybe board competency on relevant issues, it's not their full-time job. And so they can't stand it up and structure it for you. And I think that it's both the literal time and energy, and it's the reality that a social enterprise and a nonprofit are run really differently. In a nonprofit where you are trying to shelter the homeless, your orientation to the world is not about how to get, other than you have to shore up funding to get the money to shelter homeless people. It really is it is acumen, and it takes business acumen to run a nonprofit, but it is not the same as running an enterprise that is looking to generate revenue from your clients. And so I think that there's the bandwidth issue, and I think that there's the skill set translation issue, and that the person with the idea might not be the person who has the ability then to execute that idea, but they are filled with the passion for it, and want to see it happen. And so they might get themselves into a circumstance where they can't. So I just talked about pitfalls and not successes, but I think that and there are certainly many successful social enterprises, but I think that it runs the risk of being something, I would just say one more thing, something that nonprofits feel like they're forced into because foundations get tired of funding the same thing. And so they say, well, what is your new revenue stream? And the nonprofit leader goes and sits down and reads a bunch of blogs, and they're like, well, if I could sell a social enterprise, I could shore up not just that thing, but it could feed back into my nonprofit, and that's my stream to sustainability, and that's what this funder wants to hear in order to keep funding me. So I'm going to try and work it out. And so I think it can also really be driven by external foundations asking, prompting a reaction that they might not intend to.
Yeah, I've certainly seen that in practice, as I'm sure we all have. David or Aaron?
You have to tool for success, and even if it is a skunk works, if you don't have the acumen and you don't have the experience, passion and intentionality is just not going to get you there. And so the sad reality is even the small social enterprise or the small not-for-profit needs to be run with business discipline. And some of the biggest pitfalls we've seen is that energy alone can only take an opportunity so far, and you've got to tool for success. You've got to put the right people in the seats that will give the opportunity the potential for viability.
Eric, anything from you on this? Okay. So we're going to shift sort of into the last couple of questions here. And again, questions in the chat are welcome. So we've talked about this question, or that you've each answered this question in some form or another, but I'll ask it directly. As more attention is paid and organizational energy is shifted towards this social entrepreneurship as a concept, and a good concept, a concept that has a lot of potential to really scale up some good works in the community. How do, both within your organizations and advice for any organization considering engaging in this kind of activity, how do you make sure that that mission component is central, or at least is a fundamental part of the social enterprise decision-making process?
So for us, I would say it's baked into our mission. Our mission is the social enterprise that we're engaged in. It's hard to separate the two, but it's tied together, and literally one supports the other, right?
Yeah, and that could be the. I think that's a good answer. I mean, it's literally what we're structured to do. I mean, we're required by our own documents to do it this way, and to keep that mission orientation. And think about that benefit corporation. Corporate structure that I discussed, one of the benefits, no pun intended, one of the benefits of having a benefit corporation, it is that there's no questions about whether mission should be part of the conversation. It has to be part of the conversation.
Yeah, same answer as Eric's. It's not mutually exclusive for us. It's not a sidebar set of efforts. It's core, it's central to the way in which we think about the way in which where we place our money and for what purpose, for what reason, and for what outcome. So it's central.
I think that that idea makes a lot of sense. I think a little tangential to your question, Alex, but there is a growing skepticism, I think, of market-based approaches and social enterprise kinds of things to combat real issues of poverty, hunger, sort of real social issues. That there was, I feel like, an upswing where there was a big push for a while around market-based solutions were the answer to everything. And what we really need to do is get market-based solutions to poverty or racial inequity or hunger or whatever it might be. That there is not on with these folks on the call, but there are some social enterprises that really feel predatory. I was just talking to a friend of mine who was talking about, she works at the food bank, and she was talking about a company that she heard of that wants to get into the market of emergency food relief, and it's not. I assume it's a social enterprise of some kind, but it's from the idea that there is profit to be gained in emergency food assistance, right? That there is a way to do that profitably, and I think that there is a bit of a backlash, in communities that I connect with around the idea that you can extract profit from the challenges of poverty, and that I think some of it's warranted. And I think that there is a risk in sort of overusing these structures to try and solve problems that really maybe should be a nonprofit working on an issue with community partners. And so this idea that both Eric and David said that it's part and parcel with their mission, they're also these two entities that are on this call really are connecting between that space of the private and the social. Companies that have solutions to health challenges really can benefit communities if they're connected in a more effective way. But there's some stuff out there that really is predatory, and there is therefore, I think, increased scrutiny around really what fits.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, and unfortunately, I've seen it too in practice where people decide, to disrupt homelessness, and it sort of perverts the whole discussion into something that just doesn't feel like this is the best path forward as a society. The other thing that we see is, and I may be preaching to the choir, but you have these conversations with, sometimes it comes from funders, sometimes it comes from business folks, but nonprofits should act more like businesses. And I think David, actually, the phrase that David used is a really excellent way to parse that out. Nonprofit leaders have to bring business discipline to running the nonprofit corporation, but there are intentionally fundamental differences between the nonprofit corporation structure and the sort of prototypical for-profit corporation structure. And so I think it's something to be mindful of, and there will be a place, and will be a place for the more traditional nonprofit corporation, in the solving the various social issues that we all face. Okay, so I've got two questions in the chat. I'll take the second one first. So as students studying to be nonprofit leaders, this is a great question. What would you say we should be paying attention to in the coming years in terms of social enterprise and social entrepreneurship?
I would say that attention needs to be paid to the jobs to still be done. A lot of us tend to barrel towards solution, and I think a lot more attention needs to be focused on the problem statement and the unpacking and the rebuilding of the problem, because solutions self-evolve. It's really identifying what those pressing problems might be, and at the first pass of that, of course, they're all a number of high-level problems. We could all probably regale each other with them on this call without any prep. It's that second and third order, the second and third order when you click into those high-level problems that will reveal the opportunities to be had in the coming years. I think the big risk that we all run is just assuming that a continuation of what we do and how we do it now is going to be successfully replicated in the future. I think we have to remain agile, and we have to be willing to pivot when it comes to the broader notion of social enterprise.
That's a great answer. Bethia.
I think that makes great sense to me, David. My small ad would be consistent with now, but when thinking about the connection between whatever the social enterprise is trying to achieve and the social component. And so there's a lot in tech, for example, where people think about bringing technology solutions that can enable and support a social mission, which can be really great and can be really effective. The being steeped in the end user or the problem statement, the thing that it's trying to connect to, matters for that isolated solution to be successful. So I think it's really about, in social enterprise, depending on what social problem you're trying to connect to or what social good you're trying to generate, really understanding both the solution and the problem in a way that can bring them together, and not being thinking that you can do that from a 1,000-foot level without really connecting with the challenge.
Awesome. Okay, so another question is my favorite question, because I think there's a lot to learn from the answers to this question. But I'll ask kind of a couple different ways, answer whichever one you want, and this is to the full group. Is there anything you would do differently Is there anything if you were there from the early days, is there anything you wish you knew when you started your social enterprise that would have made the process smoother, better? Is there anything you wish you did differently? Is there anything you wish you were doing differently now as an organization, as as an organization engaged in social enterprise activity?
Alex, I didn't know we were going to have to air that kind of dirty laundry on this call, but you know, I'll start. Arrogance was a huge early mistake for the innovation platform at when it started 7 years ago. We had a plan, we knew what we wanted to do, and we charged the hill. We just forgot one thing, and I think you've all alluded to it. We didn't ask anyone what they wanted. So we ran afoul of ignoring our own core tenet, which is human-centered design. You have to spend time with the people that you're looking to impact, gleaning those insights and having those insights inform the path that you're going to take. We told our organization that we were an innovation platform driven by design thinking. We didn't ask anyone if they understood what innovation meant or what design meant. And when you put the two together within a very traditional healthcare context, we just saw people gloss over and stop taking our calls. And so we had to go back to the corner licking our wounds, saying, you know what, we better rethink the manner in which we engage with our end user by first starting with asking the question in terms of what it is that they wanted. And there was that redo that led us to a series of reincarnations that have now become successful. But if we had to do it all over again, we wouldn't have spent the first 18 months just assuming we knew what people wanted.
I appreciate the candid feedback. I think, again, that's as valuable as anything on a conversation like this.
So I asked our CEO this question, and he's been around since the beginning of the formation of Jumpstart, and it was twofold, right? So he said on the venture capital side, if he were to go back, I think he would work harder, engaging more corporate partners, in the sense that that if you look at Columbus, if you look at Michigan, if you look at Pittsburgh, they all have very successful venture ecosystems where their numbers are off the charts, right? But the reason why they have those numbers and they're so successful is the corporate partnerships or the corporations that also got into venture capital or into the space with them. So that was the first part. And then on the second part, on the economic development side, he said that it would be where there were instances where opportunities came to Jumpstart, where the stipulation was you have to lead this, or you have to do this, or we're not gonna give this money to this community, or you have to do this, or you have to do that. And Jumpstart got put into situations where it found itself with a lot of political issues with the communities that they served, right? As far as the economic developer goes. So, for example, if KeyBank came to us and say, okay, we're gonna grant you this much money, but you have to take charge of this, be the intermediary for this program, that created a lot of hurt feelings in the community when you go to other nonprofits that were in the space. And so that, I think he said that the Jumpstart would have been more thoughtful about that. So.
Great, thank you.
These are great answers. I think that I think that some form of what David described probably shows up in most organizations who try to do something. So this, I think that when people have passion and drive, you're gonna miss something, right? And so I think to me, it's like it's the idea of making sure that I and we are listening hard regularly all the time is like a constant thing that I come back to. There was a really sort of a micro example was I remember we were working on an effort to drive some more skills-based hiring. So the idea that companies would benefit from expanding the kinds of things that they look at on resumes beyond a college degree that was just a signal of skill, but really like how do you actually understand what a person is bringing, especially for those jobs that might not require somebody to spend $100,000 on college and don't have that high an entry-level wage to really to justify that kind of educational investment and to expand opportunities. And we were talking about it with a neighborhood-based corporation that serves a predominantly Black community, and we were using the word experimentation. And I remember this person said, we are tired of people talking about experimenting on our community. And I was like, oh, that makes total sense. That's a terrible word. It's about opportunity expansion. And we want to figure out how we do it in a way that, you know, like really helps understand how we're connecting with you as the front door to the community. But just even that, like that, a word that didn't register in my day-to-day as a negative experience and how much that was a negative experience in that conversation. If that person hadn't said that to me and instead had just walked away with that negative experience, we wouldn't have been able to partner with her in order to develop this work, right? And so I think it is both about that listening and the sort of the hubris that somebody might bring to a conversation, you know, as David said, when they were launching on sort of a bigger picture way. And then I think it's also the ability to just try to make sure that we are always giving the feeling that we're open to hearing. It's not just like that you're that you're open to it, because if that person wasn't willing to say that to me, then I never would have known to adjust it, right? So I think, and I'm sure that there have been times when we didn't as an organization, institution, that I would just never know about because somebody didn't have that conversation.
Yeah, those were really three great answers. You see why it's my favorite question. So one last ask. Any final questions for our panelists? Otherwise, we'll wrap it up for the day. And I would like to say thank you to David, to Bethia, to Eric, to Danny, to Hannah for participating and facilitating today's conversation. Thanks to everybody on the call for listening in today. Danny's going to give you some housekeeping notes about sending out the materials and that sort of thing. But I really do mean it when I say that I'm happy to have these conversations with folks after the fact. If you want to talk through something, or if you're thinking about a social enterprise, or your organization is a social enterprise and you just want to bounce something off of me, I'm happy to do that. And if I don't, I always say this to clients and to others, if I don't have the answer, I'll tell you I don't have the answer, but hopefully I know somebody who does. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you to each of our panelists and to Alex for facilitating. This was fantastic. And I love when community leaders reinforce classroom ideas. We talk a lot in our program about social justice, about not doing for people without people, and about grace in receiving feedback, Bethia. So, feedback is a gift, and you have to appreciate and be grateful when you get it, even if it stings. So thank you, each of you, for sharing your insight and your experience. We are so very grateful. For those of you on the call who are considering graduate school, please consider us. For those of you on the call who someone is asking about graduate school, please consider recommending us. We really do work hard every day to develop unapologetic social justice leaders, and I'm very proud to be the director of this program and to be bringing you this program tonight. So thank you for your time, thank you for your leadership, and go forth and be safe.
Thanks, Evan.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.